Okay, we meet again in another module. This is a review of some of the things you need to do for the first assessment in sports nutrition. Okay, moving on. This is the assessment. You'll need to do a number of things, including have a hypothesis for what you do, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. We'll talk about literature review, including search terms, inclusion, exclusion criteria. We'll probably look at detailed analysis a bit later on. You'll need referencing, of course. Now, in the past, we've asked students to choose from a number of different toolkits. Given the constrained circumstances we're operating in under the moment, what we're going to suggest is we just all use the CASP, that is the Critical Appraisal Skills Programme. It's a good programme and it's very straightforward to use. Just at the most basic level, it's a box ticking exercise, so you'll need to do some higher level thinking on that. Just to emphasise, most of your report is about understanding the papers you choose. The quality analysis discussed here is important, but maybe not the main component of your report. Okay, it's about quality. In this case, quality specifically refers to the quality of the research paper as based on specific criteria and as judged on those criteria. Here's some background reading. Well worth having a read from BMJ. We'll look in more details at tools and techniques here which are specifically applicable, but this is generally useful, particularly if you're doing some project work or you're thinking of postgraduate work, especially in something like public health or dietetics later on. Well worth having a look at. I think I took this from the BMJ paper, and this mind map summarises a typical criteria used formally to judge the quality of papers. You should be familiar with many of these terms. If you've not looked them up, it looks like a lot, doesn't it? But luckily, tools like CASP will allow us to do this in a systematic way. Okay, very general weighting. Most research is in principle original. We need to distinguish between original research papers and reviews of collections of papers, and more on that in a moment. The other criteria do impact very much on the qualities of the published research, and again, we'll be looking at them in a while. For completeness, we'll talk a little bit about meta-analysis. You aren't doing a meta-analysis, but it's important in general terms. Meta-analysis is the statistical procedure for combining data from multiple studies to see if whether there is an overall effect. Widely used these days, is very important. One of the best resources for meta-analyses in critical reviews in general is the Cochrane collaboration. It's highly regarded, open source. A library of up-to-date systematic reviews and other synthesized research evidence to inform health decision-making. There's a lot in there about nutrition. There are now over 7,500 Cochrane systematic reviews published in the Cochrane library. Again, it's not appropriate for what you're doing here, but it's well worth having a look at in terms of your wider background reading, especially if you want to go into health-based areas. Okay, so we'll make that appear. Back to the assignment. You can't use meta-analysis here, just single research studies, and it's important that you do this. If you use a meta-analysis, I'm afraid that will impact very badly on your marks. Here's a couple of papers taken randomly from nutrition research. The first is a single research study, so it's acceptable here. The second is a review, as clearly stated in the title. That would be excluded. It would not be capable of being used in this type of study. So this type of paper is not appropriate to this exercise. This may not always be obvious. Reading the paper will obviously help. It will say somewhere this is a systematic review or a meta-analysis or some similar phraseology. What we want is single research papers. Okay, so CASP. CASP is a well-known and straightforward tool for rapid analysis of research papers. This is the sort of process that is carried out, for example, by funders looking at a wide range of studies before deciding which to fund further. Typically, a CASP analysis in those circumstances will be done early in the process to decide which studies should be forwarded for detailed consideration. We're doing it to look generally at the quality of published research. So this is the CASP website. The programme's been in operation for over 25 years, and in its comments on making sense of evidence it notes. But how can we know whether a claimed intervention is truly effective? Many interventions are given with the best of intentions but have later been found to be ineffective with the potential for harm and wasted resources. That's what tools like CASP are trying to avoid is trying to improve the quality of research overall, which is something you certainly should be considering. Okay, moving on. CASP uses a checklist approach and offers a range of critical appraisal tools for different research approaches. You should download and use a qualitative checklist. It's also included in the relevant learning materials folder as well. But you might want to have a look at this link for the checklist to see some of the other ones that are there, just for general background information. These three broad issues need to be considered when appraising these types of studies. You can answer them by answering the 10 questions in the CASP toolkit. At the basic level, these are yes, can't tell, and no answers. After using this toolkit in this way, you might want to consider why you chose those answers. You should consider that as you go through the process. That will help with both the assignment and the development of your critical skills, which you can demonstrate when you go for interviews for jobs or postgraduate study. So, carrying out the review, a walkthrough of the process. 3 papers probably enough. More than that, you're probably getting into a lot of work, and as reiterated earlier on, must be an original research article, not a review. And one immediate inclusion criteria is probably within the last 5 years. You probably want to stick to research done within that period. If there isn't much in that period for your particular topic, you may need to look a bit further back, but be careful about how far you go back. Things rapidly become redundant. So that's not an original research paper, so we would get rid of that. It's a review. Here are the first two questions from CASP. Are the results valid? It's asking, is there a clear statement of the aims of the research? And 2, is a qualitative methodology appropriate? And there's some hints there for you to consider and help consider your decision-making process as you go through the questions. Okay, when you've reviewed all of your papers using CASP, you need to produce an evidence table summarising the results. Again, brief comments are a good idea, and it will help you with the higher level analysis you do when you have all the information. You can, of course, sum the yeses and nos for the papers, and there's no reason not to do this. But you will also need a more thoughtful analysis, so brief comments as you go along may be very helpful. Okay, we're now going to skip back to the beginning of your process. It's important for you to know first the basis in which you would do your review. So now we're going to look at the whole overall process, starting with search terms and inclusion-exclusion criteria. You need to document your search. And there's a good example of someone documenting their search. When you start with a general search term like exercise, you will get a lot of results. Adding human will reduce the number. Adding ergogenic age will reduce still further, and adding a search term for the age of interest to you. And eventually you may find you get down to a relatively small number of papers, especially when you factor in things such as done in the last 5 years. Studies will also be excluded, more than that in a moment, on the basis of their age, language and other criteria. As I said, the image here isn't bad, but including the search terms would be helpful in terms of documentation. You will need to document and include your search terms as part of your methodology. So here's a little exercise. Generically, there's a criteria we want to include, such as human studies, and other we want to include, such as because they're too old. So pause the video if you're watching the video and think of relevant inclusion-exclusion criteria for your study. You will use these in your assignment. Here's some examples from a C&D rather than a sports nutrition perspective. Again, you will need to document and include your inclusion and exclusion criteria as part of your methodology. There's a not bad example of how to do that. Okay, so we'll now finish with an overall review of the process. We've talked about the bits and pieces. We'll now put them in the order which you would do them. So, phase 1 is choosing papers and defining your hypothesis. And we'll talk about hypothesis in the next couple of slides. Select your topic, read the literature, refine your topic, and define your hypothesis. A reminder about hypotheses. You need to clearly state the null and alternative hypotheses as part of your methodology. These will obviously depend on what your topic is, but they'll be broadly speaking structures as they are in this slide. No, we're not worried about p-values here. More whether the papers reviewed provide evidence with respect to the hypothesis. Could the papers be used to assess the hypothesis should be your sort of really high level thinking about this. It could be yes, it could be a no, it could be we can't decide. If you need to justify each of those choices. Okay, so step 2. The methodology requires documentation of the issues noted here. So if you use Science Direct or Discovery, you would notice that as your database. You would record your search terms, record your inclusion exclusion criteria and the date, and you also need full references for the selected papers. You also, of course, need to do references and citations for any papers you discuss in this context, and you're also going to want to reference CASP as well, so remember to do that. The criterion is that you have provided adequate documentation for your process to enable a second worker to reproduce your search, so that's why we include the date. This is basic scientific recording, and again, is skills which you will be able to demonstrate when you go for jobs or postgraduate interviews. Okay, you now need to review your papers with CASP, produce the evidence tables we saw above, and use this information to critically review your papers. This will be the outcome of the process. You may want to rank the papers in ways which seem appropriate to you, which you feel you can justify. It's not possible to be hard and fast about how we should do this. It really does depend on your research process and the papers you're using. And then talk about the hypothesis. Do the papers reviewed provide evidence which could be used to assess the hypotheses? So this again is higher level than what's been done just in one paper. I've got a why there. That's a short word, but it requires discussion and consideration of your results. You might also want to briefly review your result use of CASP as part of your critical analysis. Okay, that's all folks. Thanks for listening.